Okay, hello and welcome to today's webinar on assertive communication. This is Sophie from English Australia. Just before we get started, I'd like to make sure that all of the technology is working. So if you can hear my voice and see the PowerPoint slide on the screen, can you please type yes into the chat box? Wonderful. It seems that people can definitely hear me, so that's great. I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Thank you very much to Barbara Craig for coming to present the webinar today on assertive communication, which is part of the Women in Leadership series. Barbara is the acting head of centre at Macquarie University's English Language Centre, where I think she sees herself as part of a team of engaged and dynamic professionals. And she certainly discussed this style of leadership a couple of weeks ago at the NEAS conference, where she presented a session, or co-presented with her colleague Sandra Piccinacci, a session about servant leadership. Barbara was also involved in the very popular session at the English Australia conference last year called Women in Leadership, and one of the groups talked about assertive communication in that session at the conference, and feedback from that was that people wanted to hear more from the different presenters at that session, and so we invited Barb back to present her section on assertive communication. So thanks very much, Barb.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks everyone for dialing in. Before we get underway, I have a little declaration to make, and I know I'm presenting on assertive communication, but I want to say straight up that I am a fellow traveller, not an expert in the art of assertive communication. I've pulled some ideas and some research together and some obviously drawn on my own experiences as well, but I just want to say right at the start, I am not an expert, and I'm hoping that today's session will be an opportunity for us to share our experiences and our expertise. So get ready on the chat and let me know what you're thinking as you go along. You can chat at any stage. Now, there's a plethora of self-help tools out there in the world of assertive communication. And the other thing I want to say is we're not going to try and touch on everything. I've just selected a few things that I think might be a good starting point to address some of the fundamentals in looking at assertive communication. We're just scratching the surface. So, what do we want to achieve? Firstly, I thought we'd identify some of the things that influence our ability to be assertive, and then we'll look at different communication styles. And I think these two things will be quite familiar to you all. And then we'll move on to have a look at perhaps some of the more active components of assertive communication, looking at ourselves and our own role there, and also looking at the influence that we have on our environment and how that can be a preemptive measure that we can take. And lastly, we'll get to have a look at the message itself and how to communicate our message. So, what is assertive communication? I rather like this definition by Morrissey and Callahan, and many are very similar. I think they've expressed it rather neatly. I'll just give you a minute to read that. The two key things here are obviously the ability to express what we feel we need to express, but secondly, to do it in a way that's respectful to everybody involved in the conversation. I'd like to add a further thing, is that I think this is a skill that can be learned. It's not a trait that we're born with. Everyone can learn to be a good and assertive communicator, but it does involve us not just adopting a few tips and tricks, but being brave enough to go a little bit deeper into ourselves to look at our own thoughts, our own beliefs, and our own behaviours, as well as enacting those words and actions that we'll get to eventually in this presentation. All right, so over to you. If you could get on your chat and let us know some of the things that, in your experience, you think influence our ability to be assertive.
Okay, I have a few answers in. We have gender, experience, fear of offending the other, knowledge and experience, power relationships, the relationship with the person you're communicating with, confidence, personality, and support systems to accomplish the target objectives.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that one too. All right, thanks, Sophie, and thank you, everyone. Those are some really great things that you've come up with, and many of them I have as the same, some are different, so that's good. The power dynamics are a really important thing for us to consider. It changes the way we communicate. Our roles as well, closely connected to that. The situation and the context that we're communicating in. Don't forget the cultural approaches too, and particularly in our industry where many of our colleagues are from different cultures, it's easy to assume that we approach this from the same vantage point, but in fact we might not. Age, experience, gender, all of those things that you identified as well. And personal feelings, we got into that as well. Fear, I think, is a really good one to have identified because it can inhibit us detrimentally, and we need to work on how we can overcome those feelings of fear. Our prior experiences, the cultural norms, and not necessarily we're talking ethnic cultural norms, but sometimes the things that are acceptable even within a family group might not be so acceptable. If you're from a very loud family, that might not be something that's suitable to carry into the workplace. So thinking of those other kinds of cultural norms. Our personality is absolutely correct. And I do like that suggestion that the support systems also affect our ability to be assertive. And that comes into the whole environment in which we work. And we will get on to looking at that. All right, before we move on from this notion of power, roles, and context, I just wanted to acknowledge really that the way we respond in a particular situation does depend on a number of factors. And I've drawn a little diagram here of my situation here at Macquarie University, where we're part of a language centre, but that language centre is part of a bigger organisation, and that bigger organisation is part of yet another bigger organisation. And each of those levels of hierarchy, if you will, bring their own particular challenges as to how we need to communicate with different people at the different levels. So for example, it's not a given that just because we're comfortable in our own language centre that's an easy place to communicate assertively. Sometimes it's really difficult to communicate with our colleagues, our peers, people who once were our peers. And then moving into the bigger organisation, there's a different power dynamic, and we move into a situation where we begin not to have influence over the environment that communication is happening in. And the further we go from our home base, the less influence we tend to have on environmental factors, and that brings its own sets of challenges. And for those in private alicos, it might be you've got your own situation. I know it'll be different to each one, but it might be that your centre is owned by somebody who owns a larger number of companies, etc. So you can apply that diagram to your particular situation, if you will. I want to spend a little moment talking about communication styles. I think you'll be quite familiar with some of these already. I've chosen to talk about three simply because I couldn't quite work out how to do another third dimension to put in the fourth. We've got the unassertive or the passive communicator, and I think you'll recognize them. They're the ones whose focus is they're a bit timid, and they're focused on everybody else's rights, on everyone else and not on me. We've got the assertive, which is the green zone that we're aiming to communicate within, and that's where we recognize that everybody who's a part of a conversation have rights, have opinions. And then at the far end we have the aggressive communicator, who's more concerned with themselves, with their own message, with their own rights. The fourth dimension I haven't put in is that passive-aggressive, where we see some elements of the passive and the aggressive. So if you can imagine that sort of somehow sitting circularly above all the rest, then that would be a miracle. All right, so let's have a look a little bit at a little bit more detail. So the assertive and the assertive passive communicator is somebody that's actually in the marketplace a little bit hard to respect. Their starting position is expectation that they will lose and that you will win, that they're wrong in some way, that their opinion is of little worth, and actually they'd rather be anywhere than there. The aggressor, if we want to just scoot across to the far end, is someone who is the opposite of that. They give little respect and probably receive little respect as a response. They're all about I win and you lose. They're not really so concerned with your responses here, and often have that really aggressive fighting kind of response and feel the need to push things through, otherwise nothing will happen. The green zone, the assertives, we're looking for that win-win, the mutual respect where everybody's ideas are important, where we're each responsible for our own behaviour and we can't try and manage everybody else's. I should make it really clear that these aren't actual people, of course, and no one person is fully in the blue zone and no one person is fully in the red hot zone, and that we all exist somewhere along the scale to one degree or another in the various areas that we operate. Let's have a little look at some of the characteristics. How do these different communication styles express themselves? So the unassertive person will often be quite apologetic. I'm sorry, if you don't mind, lots of deferential type of language, or sometimes they're completely silent, especially in a meeting. Or sometimes they do not stop talking, but what they're talking about is very vague, it's woolly, it's avoiding the point because they're afraid of committing to an idea because they're afraid of upsetting people or of being exposed in some way. Often they come across as a little bit disingenuous too, because we don't get to see the real person. And again, the focus isn't really on problem solving. They're more in that world of thinking about everybody who's at the table or part of that discussion, rather than coming to fruitful conclusions. The aggressive person is the must win, the superior attitude. Often they speak very fluently and very fast and won't let anyone interrupt them. And I think you've probably got people in your own minds where you know that you're just waiting for them to draw breath so you can shut them down. But somehow miraculously many of them actually don't seem to breathe very often. They've got the art of dominating the conversation down pat. They're not very tolerant of other opinions or ideas and often use tactics like sarcasm or put downs to control those around them, and they can be quite threatening verbally or even physically. The green zone, we know this is where we're aspiring to be open, to be honest, for our speech to be fluent and uncluttered, our voice to be even and clear, our interactions to be genuine and authentic, to be asking questions, seeking the opinions of others. To be able to distinguish fact from opinion. Often our aggressor isn't so good. They will conflate the two, but the assertive person is quite happy to separate the two. And then just quickly looking at physical expression, the unassertive is often that closed, hunched posture, minimal eye contact, almost appearing defeated. Interestingly, the aggressor is often with a closed posture as well, arms across the chest, not very open. They could be agitated. They could overly use eye contact to the extent where they're staring people down. And the beautiful assertive person is in that natural, open, upright posture, natural eye contact, and there is a feeling of authenticity and genuineness about them. As I say, no one's perfect. No one's in any of these particular categories fully. We all tend to move along the spectrum depending on the situation we find ourselves in. However, the green is where we're aspiring, right? Okay, so over to you. Sophie, I thought that this might be a good time perhaps to do the poll.
Sure. So a question's going to appear on your screen, and if you could just answer it, please.
So just while you're doing that, what I'm interested in hearing about from you are the situations where you find it most challenging to be assertive. I understand you can only choose one answer here, so have a little careful think.
You can actually choose more than one.
Oh, can you really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sophie. Choosing 5 might challenge the outcome.
Okay, most people have voted, so I'll share the answers now.
Okay.
Can you see the answers, Barb?
I can't see the answers at all.
Oh, okay. The attendees are viewing the poll results.
Okay, good. Maybe you just want to tell me what they are.
Yeah. So 20% of people said that being heard in a meeting was the most challenging to be assertive. 13% said expressing your opinion to your boss. The majority, 73%, said holding a colleague accountable for their actions. And finally, 27% as a manager giving feedback or instructions to a former peer.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That's overwhelming, isn't it? All of the we recognise all of those situations are challenging, and it is interesting to see just how difficult it is to talk with people that we work with every day. Their opinion of us counts, doesn't it? And we don't want to offend them. We know that whatever happens, we've got to turn up to work again tomorrow and the day after and continue building a relationship with them and working through this. And yet this is where most assertive communications can break down. So what do we do about that? Well, oh, I forgot Dr. Zeus. There you go. It all starts with us. I know it's tempting to try and latch straight on to the tips and tricks, but we're going to take the slow road there. So it starts with me. And the first thing we need to start doing is to reflect. If we find ourselves needing to have a conversation with one of our colleagues, for example, it's good to start off by thinking, what do I already know about this person or these people? It might be a new relationship, or it might be one of several years standing. Either way, draw on what we know, because that will help us prepare for potential responses, and it will also help us prepare for the best way in which to phrase what we're going to say. Think about the past, think about interactions you've had with that person in the past, think about how well they've gone and what lessons you can draw from them, and think about how perhaps you've had a similar message said to you, or maybe one that you've said to someone else, not that same person, and draw on the things that impressed you at that time, good and bad. All right, the next thing is self-awareness. How does that person make me feel? What is the nature of our relationship? One of the key things that's important to do is to keep building a trust bank so that the relationship is strong, and we'll come to that in a moment. But it's important to acknowledge how that person makes us feel. It might be a long time of being constantly irritated by that person. It may be that you feel intimidated by that person, or it could be that you're actually a really close colleague, close friend, and you've always worked well together, and it's a really solid relationship. Any of those situations need us to think carefully about how we proceed. How are we feeling now? And what are the things that might be difficult in this upcoming conversation? I've put another point there, how do I want to be perceived? And that's not in terms of the communication style, but it's in terms of how will the person receive my message? Will this be something that they accept as being delivered in a sense of goodwill and aspiring to the greater good? Moving on, self-talk. Prepare your mind and remind yourself of what your strengths are. This is pretty good when you're coming into talking with your boss, when you're going into a meeting. Sometimes we feel like the newbie on the block, or we suffer a little bit of imposter syndrome. I know most of us do. So it's good just to pause and think about what our strengths actually are, because we're bringing those into the conversation, and to remind ourselves that what we think and feel, our ideas and our opinions, have value, and that we express them because we have our eyes on the greater good for the relationship, the greater good for the organization that we work in, the greater good for the students. So it's a responsibility to some degree. And underlying all of this are our beliefs and our principles. It's really important, as we noted before from that scale we looked at, that we're genuine. There's real power in authenticity. We can spot a fake, can't we? But authenticity is very hard to respond negatively to. It's good to reaffirm to ourselves what our principles are, what we believe about our role and responsibilities, and what are our boundaries. How far am I prepared to compromise or to go in this conversation? Okay, we're going to keep moving on. I'm keeping an eye on the time. And the next thing I want to talk about is the environment, because it's one thing to work on ourselves, and that has to be our starting point. But by looking at the environment in which we work, there are some gains to be made here, in that our influence can set up how things turn out. I've just put a little wee picture for those of you who know Charlotte's Web. Charlotte was very aware of environment, and she was great at creating a positive environment around the Little Pig Wilbur, for those of you who know Charlotte's Web. For those of you who don't, it's a terrific read. All right, so over to you on the chat again. How can we create an environment which optimizes the likelihood of positive outcomes to these assertive interactions?
So if you just type your answers into the chat box, and then I can relay some of them. Okay, wonderful. So we have creating a climate of trust and a collaborative culture. Someone's talked about the privacy versus the openness of the space the meeting's taking place in, depending on the situation. Someone has said to begin with something positive. Maintain respect and open communication. Leave more time for face-to-face meetings and face-to-face time in general.
All right, that's a wonderful list. And that notion of trust and collaboration are absolutely key. So let's have a look at some of my ideas about how they're not really just mine, ideas I've gathered together of building environmental influence. Because if we can build an environment and of course this happens over time, but if we can build an environment where there is trust and collaboration, we might find two things. One is that the number of times we need to have these difficult conversations reduces, and the second thing is that when they do happen, because they will, the likelihood of success is raised. So here we go. First thing, relationships, absolutely key. Don't forget to smile. We often forget to smile in our busyness and the pressure. A smile goes such a long way. Take time to connect with others. When things are good, when things are bad, just generally day to day, take time to sit and to chat or say hello. We have to be respectful of time and those sorts of constraints, but go out of our way to connect with others and to build those positive, respectful relationships. It does take time. The next thing, communication, starts with listening. If we listen well, then we can generate understanding and a willingness for others to listen to what we have to say. Somebody said start with the positive, and that's very true. And I wouldn't say just start with the positive, but try and phrase everything that you say in a positive way. Be clear, be concise, be personal. Now, just to remind you, these are all things that happen before there's that difficult conversation that perhaps we need to have. So it's about building the general way that we choose to communicate with people in our work environment. Be honest, be authentic, and remember that our actions are also speaking. It's not just what we say, it's what we do, and it's how we do it. Collaboration came up, which was good to hear. Be a contributor. Don't wait for others, but you yourself get in first and be a contributor. Seek the input and the opinions of others. Again, this often comes back to listening, and help others to find their own voice. If we can help others to express their feelings well, we will often find that they'll be supportive of us in situations, particularly in meetings where we are attempting to have our voices heard. So rally the troops. And then finally, I want to come back to beliefs and principles, because no matter what we do in our work and outside of work, our beliefs and our principles will come through. So it's good to keep coming back to look at those. Be consistent with what we believe, express that. Know what the team values are and embody them. Work on that shared plane of understanding. And walk your talk. Show respect, which came up. All right, are there any questions, just flicking back, sorry, any questions about building environmental influence? This is before we've got to the message. It's about creating a culture and a community where communication is clear and positive. If there are no questions,
no
I'll
questions
keep going.
coming up.
All right.
You can save questions for later if you have them as well.
All right. So now let's head to the message itself. The first thing is the goal or the outcome. Before we head into any situation where we need to deliver a message which might be difficult, or it might be difficult because of the content, or it might be difficult because of the situation, it's very important for us to be able to distill that goal or the outcome we want from that interaction into a short phrase or sentence. If we can keep that front of mind, then wherever the conversation goes, we can not lose track of the thread and of where we want this to end up. In some situations, the literature says it's really good to put the key point first, a bit like a thesis statement when we're writing an essay. You know about the sound bite or the sound grab, and we see this on television all the time, where it's obvious that there's been an interview that might have lasted 5, 10, 15 minutes, who knows, but because of restrictions on what goes to air, there's just a small chunk of it that goes. And I think the average is, somebody will correct me on this, but I think it's around 7 seconds that goes to air. And that is our sound grab or our sound bite, the most powerful bit of what we say. Now, that can be used positively and negatively, and I think we've seen that in the media. And what we want as assertive communicators is to make sure that that sound bite, that thing that people go away with, is the message that we want them to remember. So that comes back to our first point, where it's really important to be able to summarize that short phrase or sentence. And it might be that you revisit that sentence and weave it through that conversation, not so that it's boring, but so that it is lasting in the memory of those who are part of the conversation. The idea of putting our key point first is really useful in meetings where we might have just a slight moment to get our point across because everybody's got their little moment, or when we're speaking with somebody who's really busy, who doesn't have time for the whole backstory, somebody like your boss or a busy colleague. So again, be selective with when you use this approach, because in the wrong context it can sound a little bit harsh and abrupt. Once we've managed to express that key idea, then we can go back and build our supporting ideas and think about ordering them and all those things that we're actually quite used to doing because we've all taught essay structure somewhere in our professional lives. All right. Not that we want an essay, just to clarify. Okay, so the next thing, this is a different approach. It's called the desk 4-step approach, developed by Bauer and Bauer way back last century in the 70s. And it's still used today and referred to often, and I'm sure it's something that you are quite familiar with as well, but it's worth talking about it today because it's a tool that you can use. All right, so DESC is an acronym. D is for describing the observed action or behavior that you want to address. So for example, you might say something like, John, it was really good to hear your opinions in the meeting today, but did you realize that you cut me off before I had finished? Gentle, objective, and non-threatening. E stands for express. Express how you feel or the impact of that behavior. This is where the I statements come in. Unfortunately, John, it's not the first time that you've done this, and I find that this is really frustrating because I had something that I really wanted to say and didn't have that opportunity. S is for suggesting an alternative. Next time, John, it would be really great if you could let me finish before you start. And C is for consequences, and also some of the more modern models of this talk about consensus. So sometimes we can skip straight to consensus if John says, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I really didn't realize. Of course, I'll let you finish, and I do apologize. That would be ideal. But if John says, I didn't cut you off, or you'd finished, I thought you'd finished, or became quite defensive, then we might need to move to this step of talking about consequences. So we might say to John, if we do this, then it's really obvious that we're working as a team and we're working towards the same end. Or if it needs to be a negative consequence, it might be necessary to even say to John, if it happens again, I'm going to have to say something in the meeting, and I really don't want to embarrass you by doing that. And then let's get to the delivery. These are the things that we know well. Body language, that open posture, thinking about our voice, keeping it clear, keeping it calm, keeping it steady. Don't race. Use silence as well as active voice. Facial expressions, the smile, the warmth, the eye contact. Keep in mind that you're dealing with a relationship, and the intent here is not just to communicate your message, but to continue the relationship as well. So choosing our words very carefully. All right, so those are some top tips, or not tips, the things behind the tips. I want to move to back to our sliding scale that we looked at earlier, and talk about how we might deal with people who challenge us. Difficult people is one way to describe it. I'm a bit ambivalent about that phrase, but people with difficult behaviours, should we say. So let's go back to our scale of communicative styles. And I'd really love for us at this stage to pool our knowledge on techniques that you have used successfully to manage, firstly, the aggressive communicator. This might be in a meeting that you've been chairing or part of, or somebody who just day to day always feels like they are pushing their opinion on others. Have we got time to just chat quickly into that chat field, your ideas about successes, techniques that you've used?
Okay, there's a few coming through. I'll just wait another 10 seconds.
Sure.
Okay. Someone said match their tone. Another person said let them have their say. Maintain eye contact. Listen to the person and repeat what you interpret as their meaning. Show empathy. Acknowledge that you hear their message. And finally, it's difficult to do, although effective, veil the buttons that are being pushed.
All right, that's a good one. They're all very, very good and totally in line with what the literature says. So you're obviously all well read and doing the right things, which is marvelous. It is important to let people have their say, and just because they're aggressive, it doesn't mean that their ideas aren't worth listening to. The idea of being able to summarize, especially in a meeting that might have gotten out of control a little bit, to be able to interrupt if necessary and wrap up what you feel that person is saying, and then take that opportunity to then move on to the next item or the next person being able to have their say, is another key technique. It's important for us to remember that there are probably some deep issues driving the behaviour of the aggressive person. Ours isn't to try and solve those issues, but it does help for us to understand that they are human, and that all of us are a product of our environment to one degree or another. Even though they might try and personalize the situation, it's really important to try and depersonalize it, not see this as a personal attack, but to see this more as something which reflects where they themselves are coming from. If you can deflect with appropriate humour, then do so, but I say that with a word of caution. It can go wrong, so be careful about that. Know the person that you're dealing with well. And this is a good time where you might want to choose the right moment, not when they're in mid-flight, but in a quiet moment, to employ that desk model. It pays to practice that one first. If they are in mid-flight, you might need to close that conversation down and come back when everything is calmer. All right, let's move on. Let's have a look at the passive communicator, the person who is in that blue zone, who's defeated before they've begun. Have you got some key ideas that you have found really useful here? Again, on the chat would be marvellous.
Okay, there's a couple of suggestions. Ask questions to draw them out. Use open-ended questions. Ask them for their opinion and value their answer. try not to be the expert, and compliment them on what they do well.
Yes. And I think as teachers, most of us actually are quite good at dealing with this blue end of the scale, and drawing out those quiet people in the class. And really, it's the same principles employed here. Those open questions go a long way. And I'm going to start with the same point, because we're all just a little bit human and we're all a little bit imperfect. So it's good to recognize that this person who is the passive communicator is walking along their own journey, and that there are issues that have brought them, or not even issues, but there are things that have happened that have brought them to this particular belief pattern and way of behaving. As you've correctly said, let's elicit their opinions, ask them questions, ask those open questions. I like that someone said, don't be the expert. It's important to hear what everybody has to say. Also, give them time to formulate their own responses, especially if they're introverted. There might be a whole conversation happening in their head that we can't hear and we can't see in their face, but it will come out if we give them time and don't rush them. Listen and affirm, compliment those things that you have said. All right, and then finally, the final chat is to just have a look at the passive aggressive, or that manipulative communicator, and they're quite difficult to deal with. Have you had success? If so, we want to hear about it. Can you type your responses there, please?
Okay. We have keep good records, keep the conversation on task, don't get sucked into their games, depersonalize it, and point out the manipulation techniques and ask them to confirm their intention.
Okay, so here we have to be a little bit more on the front foot, and I love those ideas that you have. And unfortunately, it is true that we need to keep good records, because with the passive aggressive, and please forgive my lack of a hyphen there, with the passive aggressive, sometimes things can go south, and it's important that we have a record in case things get escalated. Keeping them on task, not buying into their behavior or playing their games, and directly addressing the games that they're playing or the manipulative behavior that you're sensing is really good. The thing about the passive-aggressive communicator is they'll often deny it. They'll try and make it our problem again, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't identify that behavior. Just tread very carefully. Asking them to affirm is a nice idea, but often they won't, because that's part of the game that they're playing. All right, and just a couple of ideas from me which are echoing the ones that we've already talked about. Again, recognizing that this behavior comes from somewhere. This is a place where the desk model again is quite useful. And with the passive-aggressive communicator, they do seem to respond, it seems, to the C part of the desk, and that is the consequences, because they don't want to be exposed, and they don't want anything to be public or to be escalated in a way that they can't control. So it's not that you put the C, the consequences, in a way that's threatening, but this is a natural consequence of the behavior that they are choosing to display. And it could be a consequence for them, or it could be a consequence, again, enacting that greater good. If we cannot communicate clearly, then our centre suffers, our students suffer, etc. And as part of that, just identifying and affirming the consequences of their behaviour. Again, sometimes humour can de-escalate something, but again, use it appropriately and affirm where appropriate. Often the passive-aggressive communicator is one who is deeply fearful, and we know that there are probably esteem issues, so it never hurts to affirm people. If we can find something genuine, and we can be genuine in the affirmation. If we can't be genuine, then it's probably better not to be, because I think our own authenticity is really important, as is our own integrity. All right, so to summarize, I'd just like to, this is quite quick, and at the end of this, if you have some questions, I'm really happy to answer them. So reflecting and respecting yourself, your own ideas, your opinions, your thoughts, your feelings, building your own self so that your beliefs and your confidence equip you well for whatever conversation you find yourself in. Give yourself permission to make mistakes and to grow, and remember that we need to give others that same permission to make mistakes and to grow, and to work together to create an environment where that is expected, and that ability to move on from a mistake is something that the whole community owns and buys into. We have to remember that everyone has an idea and an opinion, and getting differing perspectives is critical to our growth and function as people, but also as a language centre. Listen carefully and attentively. You'll know this as active listening. It's a human need. We all need to be understood, and sometimes it's tempting to wait for others to understand us before we turn around and understand them. But the most powerful thing is to start by understanding others. And that starts with listening. Stephen Covey says, seek first to understand and then to be understood. And actually, if the person in the conversation feels understood, we know that they are much more likely to be calm and be settled, and then to try and understand you as well. So get curious. What are they really saying? What are they not saying? Read the verbal and the non-verbal cues. Seek clarification when necessary, ask questions, and further the conversation. Take it somewhere with further questions or with your own contribution as well. Empathy, what are they feeling? And as we've already said a number of times, it's really important to reflect back what we hear and to summarize what we think that we have heard. It's good for the person who has delivered that message to know, they know then that they have been heard, but also it's an opportunity for us to be corrected if we've understood things wrongly. All right, remember, don't focus on the person, focus on the issue, the behavior, the problem. I think most of us would know this and would do it intuitively, but there are times where we know that we can slip into, especially when we're angry, we can slip into thinking about the person and not the behavior. So resist that urge to personalize things or to blame others. Be really clear about what the issue is, use specific language and focus on that. Remember your sound grab. Be solution focused and be prepared to negotiate and collaborate. None of us have all the answers, and we are after that win-win situation. And there's another example of how we can perhaps talk to our colleagues about things that are quite difficult. I'll let you read that. Okay. All right, be aware of our own emotions, our position, and our bias. So that's our role as well when I say position. If we have a bias, then it's probably good just to expose that using the I statements. Recognize how we feel, get our emotions under control. Breathe, a few good breaths, good for everyone. Understand that we're never going to change the deeper issues within somebody's lives, and that it's ultimately their responsibility to monitor their own actions and their language. However, we can express how we receive things. And then finally, it's important for us to communicate with clarity. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Don't walk into a situation thinking you've got it under control because you've got a general idea in your mind. It's really important to be clear. And attached to that is the need to rehearse. In front of the mirror, in front of the dog, in front of a colleague, a trusted colleague, if it's somebody who's maybe a colleague can be difficult, but maybe a neutral third party if you've got one. But the mirror works pretty well. All right, be intentional with your actions and your message. Don't leave things to chance, but be genuine, respond naturally, differentiate between fact and opinion, and be prepared for that sound grab to come through and be woven through your message. In a meeting, and especially in a meeting where we're outside our language centre and we're dealing in an environment where we have very little influence, it's really helpful sometimes to have an ally that we've met with beforehand so that you can run through the agenda together, you can run through anything that you think needs to be said so that you know that you've got some backup there. And the other thing about meetings, sometimes when it's something outside of our sphere of influence, there's assumed knowledge, and the meeting items can run very quickly and people are very quick to get their idea. And so if you can think of a way to buy time, then, and it's appropriate to do so, then do that. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our my ideas for you. What I have done is just put together a little homework sheet for those who are interested, and I think, Sophie, they'll be able to access this on the website.
Yes.
Great. So these are just some situations that are things that happen every day, and I thought by giving you some things that were out of context for you, within context but not actually real situations, it might give you a chance to plan how you would respond should you find yourself in that situation. You could even do some role play with a colleague if you want to go that far and develop yourself. And then here are some useful self-help resources. Some of these you might already recognise, and list of some more great reading for you if you so wish. So that's it from me, unless you have any questions.
Okay, thanks, Barb, also for leaving us with some activities to keep thinking about what we've spoken about today, and also for the reading. If you have any questions, just type them into the chat box and then I can relay them for you.
It could be a thought too, and I acknowledge that there is greater experience in this audience than I have myself, so I'm very keen to hear thoughts as well.
Yeah, the experience certainly came out in all of the answers that people were putting forward, the ideas.
Yes, yeah.
So, Barb, there are quite a few comments saying thank you. That was excellent. That was great. No questions as yet.
Great. All right. Well, it's been my pleasure. So thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just maybe wait 10 more seconds. Sometimes the questions take a little while to come through. Okay, I don't think there are any questions, but again, there are more thank yous, and that it was really helpful. Someone has a thought. They said, I went to a talk the other day about naming the behaviour, where you state the behaviour you're observing and then remain silent until the other person speaks.
I can imagine that would be really powerful.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. So there's lots of thank yous, and thank you for the practical tips. And yeah, I'd just like to also echo those thank yous from English Australia. So that was a really useful session, Barb, for people right across the spectrum to communicate more assertively and authentically, as you say. So thank you very much for delivering this session for us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you to everyone for attending. I'll be posting the webinar recording and the slides on the English Australia website. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.